So we'll give it a few more minutes, and then like 1 more minute, and then we'll get started.
Perfect.
Alrighty,
All
we can
right.
go ahead and get started.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, joining the Austin Justice Coalition and AURA for this joint event presenting Segregated by Design, which is a short film by Mark Lopez. It's based on the book, based on a book
The Color of Law. The Color of Law?
By Richard Rothschild, thank you. And it's examining the history of our federal, state, and local governments unconstitutionally segregating every major metropolitan area in the United States through law and policy. And after the short film, we'll be having a panel discussion on the history and current debate in Austin surrounding land use, affordability, and gentrification. My name is Cesar Acosta. I'm the president of AURA, and I will be co-hosting tonight's event with Kendra Garrett, who's the Director of Community Housing and Development for the Austin Justice Coalition. In a few minutes, we'll start the film, and afterwards, Kendra and I will ask the panelists a set of prepared questions, after which we will ask questions from the audience. So please, if you have any questions, put them into our Q&A box, should be below in your screen, and post them there. And if you post them to the chat, Kendra and I will be also redirecting them to the Q&A box as well. And we'll have those questions for the discussion as well. So thank you all so much for participating in tonight's event. Thank you to our panelists who we'll be introducing after the film. And I hope you all enjoy. And Kendra, I'll leave it on to you to go ahead and get us started.
Perfect, thank you so much. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and then we're gonna get this film started. Thank you so much for attending.
In the middle of the 20th century, the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and the United States federal government condemned and demolished the neighborhoods in downtown St. Louis where African Americans lived, displacing thousands. They built the Gateway Arch. They built a university, interstate highways, hospitals, and middle-class housing that was unaffordable to the former African American residents. Those who were displaced then relocated to the few other places available, converting inner-ring suburbs like Ferguson into new segregated enclaves. We have been led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, the history that was once well known but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation, racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it. The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and a project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them. As a result, they bought their homes on contract, like an installment plan where they accumulated no equity and could be evicted from their homes in the event of a single missed payment. Thus, contract buyers did not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. The term redlining comes from the federal government's creation of maps of urban areas nationwide. And those maps were color-coded to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived, even places where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky for the FHA to insure. The FHA's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in white neighborhoods, or even if they bought homes near those neighborhoods, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and then the FHA approved the loan. In the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. In fact, often racial integration caused property values to increase because African Americans' housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540-square-foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African Americans opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market. As the federal government concentrated low-income African Americans in single neighborhoods, the homes became overcrowded. Families had to subdivide their homes to make their mortgage payments or their property tax payments. Cities frequently withdrew public services from African American neighborhoods. They collected garbage less frequently. They didn't provide water and sewer services. Polluting industry and toxic waste plants were placed in African American communities in order to protect white neighborhoods from deterioration. The result was that African American neighborhoods frequently turned into slums. White homeowners looked at these places and assumed that slum conditions were characteristics of African Americans, not of government policy that forced this kind of overcrowding. White homeowners then became resistant to African Americans moving into their neighborhoods because they thought they would bring slum conditions with them. Of course, the slums were not created by the people. They were created by the forced concentration, the overcrowding in these neighborhoods. Blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African-American families at above-market prices, persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African-American slums and that values would soon fall precipitously, and then purchased the panicked white homes for less than their worth. Blockbusters' tactics included hiring African-American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African-American men to drive cars with radios blasting through white neighborhoods, or making random telephone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking to speak to someone with a stereotypically African-American name, like Johnny May. State licensing agencies that regulated real estate agents could have easily stopped this practice. All they had to do was to lift the license of one or two real estate agents who engaged in these practices, and the practices would have ended. While many de jure segregation policies aimed to keep African Americans far from white residential areas, public officials also shifted African American populations away from downtown business districts so that white commuters, shoppers, and business elites would not be exposed to black people. This was accomplished with slum clearance. One slum clearance tool was the construction of the federal interstate highway system. In many cases, state and local governments, with federal acquiescence, designed interstate highway routes to destroy urban African American communities. In the 1950s, there was a white middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles that wealthy African Americans began to move into. It was called Sugar Hill. The first thing that happened was that the neighborhood association got together and tried to buy out the African American families who were moving in, offering them more money than the African Americans had paid in order to get them out of the neighborhood. When that didn't work, white homeowners tried to enforce a legal agreement prohibiting them from living in the neighborhood. And when that didn't work, the city council then decided it would be an African-American neighborhood. It rezoned it for multiple family housing. It eventually became a slum. And then the Santa Monica Freeway was built to clear that slum to destroy the neighborhood. So these policies all worked together in an unconstitutional fashion to segregate Los Angeles. In 1957, Bill and Daisy Myers were able to purchase a home in Levittown, Pennsylvania, the Levitt Company's second large development. When the mail carrier discovered that he was delivering mail to an African-American family, he let everyone in the neighborhood know, and as many as 600 white demonstrators soon showed up in front of the Myers' house, pelting the family and their home with rocks. Law enforcement stood by as this happened. For 2 months, rocks were thrown, crosses were burned, the Ku Klux Klan symbol was painted on the wall next door. Some policemen stood with the mob, joking and encouraging its participants. One sergeant was actually demoted to patrolman because he objected to orders he had been given not to interfere with the rioters. In 1951, World War II veteran Harvey Clark, his wife Janetta, and 2 small children rented an apartment in all-white Cicero, a suburb of Chicago. When the Clarks refused to leave, a mob of 4,000 rioted, raiding the apartment, destroying the fixtures, and throwing the family's belongings out the window onto the lawn where they were set ablaze. Time magazine reported that the police officers present, quote, acted like ushers politely handling the overflow at a football stadium, unquote. The only people that the grand jury indicted were Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him, as well as her attorney, on charges of inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values. Stories like this were commonplace, and state-sponsored violence was a means, along with many others, by which all levels of government maintained segregation. Today, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans who, for the most part, were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases. Consider children who come from families where they're economically stressed, or in poor health because they have no access to good health care, or because they live in polluted environments. When they do come to school, for example, they may suffer from asthma because of that pollution and are drowsy from being awake at night, wheezing. They cannot then typically achieve at levels of children who come to school well rested. When you concentrate children like that in single classrooms, it's impossible for teachers to develop the kind of outcomes that they can in middle-class children who come to school healthy, unstressed, and able to pay attention to schooling. What economists know is that African American children from low-income families who grow up in segregated neighborhoods are less likely as adults to move into the middle class than are African American children whose families have the same low incomes but who live in integrated neighborhoods. So segregation itself impedes intergenerational mobility and perpetuates, rigidifies the inequality that we experience. Another thing that social psychologists have discovered is that decision-making is hampered when you don't have diverse decision-making groups. These psychologists have done experiments where they put people together to solve problems in both diverse groups and in segregated groups. And the diverse groups are much better able to solve problems because they challenge assumptions much more than the segregated groups do. So segregation impedes our political and economic success. We have 3 provisions in the federal Constitution that prohibit the kinds of actions that federal, state, and local governments pursued to create residential segregation. One is the 5th Amendment, which requires the federal government to treat all citizens fairly. Another is the 14th Amendment that requires state and local governments not only to treat citizens fairly, but to treat them equally. And then the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also requires that we banish the effects of slavery, which Congress long ago determined was any form of second-class citizenship. So in fact, the prohibition on African Americans to purchase homes in federally subsidized white communities or the segregation of public housing created a form of second-class citizenship which was a violation of the 13th Amendment. We cannot reverse de jure segregation mainly with lawsuits. We must also build a national political consensus leading to legislation, a challenging but not impossible task. Our focus now should be to develop policies that promote an integrated society, understanding that it will be impossible to fully untangle the web of unconstitutional inequality that we've woven. To begin, we should first contemplate what we have collectively done and, on behalf of our government, accept responsibility to fix it.
All right. I'm gonna ask all of the panelists to come back. Fantastic. Wow. That was an amazing film. And so I wanted to, we're gonna, before we start into the panel questions, I want to introduce our fantastic panel that we have tonight. First, we have Mayor Pro Tem and Presumptive County Attorney Delia Garza with us tonight, followed by we have the Anti-Displacement, City of Austin Anti-Displacement Officer Neferetitti Jackmon with us. And then we have co-founder of Equidadatx, Mr. Ashton Cumberbach, and Housing Works board member and executive committee member of Planning Our Communities, Mr. Azhar. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I'll kind of get started with our first question, right? And so this is kind of targeted towards Delia, Ms. Mayor Tim Garza, and Ashton. After watching the video, what are some central actions around land use policy and real estate and lending practices that have shaped Austin, the Austin that we live in today?
I'll let Mayor Pro Tem go.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks. And thank you to AJC and AURA for providing this space for a very important conversation about the history that has created segregation in our city and ways we can change that and hopefully reverse many of the policies that created the current situation. So redlining, just as the film described, happened in Austin. The discussion about the highway, the interstate, exactly those exact things happened here in Austin. Difficulty in families, African-American families, Latino families being able to get mortgages happened here in Austin, just like it did throughout our country. But I kind of want to take a little step back, and I have to credit, during the discussion of our reforming our land development code, I saw an interview with former Mayor Will Wynn, and he kind of described the situation that we're in with, and how it has affected our housing shortage. And, he said when a zoning case would come before, it has all these steps, and I'm not going to get too far into that, but it has steps, goes before a contact team or a neighborhood association. And even though all the market studies show that area and that piece of property could support a 200 unit apartment complex, it goes before, a neighborhood association or a contact team, and they say, well, we don't want a 200 unit. We could deal with the 151. So then now it's a 150, unit apartment complex. And then it goes before the council, and the council gets, political pressure about an apartment complex. And it goes from 150 unit apartment complex to 100 unit. And so I thought that was a really good explanation of the housing crisis that we're in, and how our regulations have created situations and why we haven't been able to keep up with the unit count. And I consistently, every single, if it's an affordable housing case or a multifamily case, I always hear, we're not against affordable housing. We just don't think that's the right place for it. And it's the same thing every single time. And so I think, decades of that kind of, dynamics essentially have created the housing crisis that we're in now and created a lot of segregation.
So I'll jump in. In addition to what Mayor Pro Tem said, just for folks who aren't familiar with Austin, just to know how entrenched this into Richard Rothstein's point about how the government was involved in this. 1928 was the master plan that the city council came up with after hearing from a consultant on how to best legally get around the laws that prevented segregation. And so they came up with a plan to move Blacks and later Hispanics from east of what was then called East Avenue, what we call I-35 now, which essentially runs from Texas to Minnesota, east of that street. And they forced them out. And as Rothstein said, those that were slow to move, that if trash wasn't picked up, they were fined. And if they were fined and didn't pay the fine, then they were removed from their home. So everything they had, they were told to leave behind simply because of the way they looked. And, you know, it's very easy to look at that from an antiseptic point of view and just say, oh, that was back then, too bad, too sad. But the results of that still remain with us today. And today, even though we have a majority of Blacks and Brown east of I-35 for a long time now, and east of 183, there's no library east of 183. We don't have not only food deserts in the eastern crescent of Austin, but we have retail deserts. We have financial institution deserts. So we have this lack of amenities that the rest of Austin enjoys, and it flows. These are one of the direct consequences of that 1920 plan, which was affirmed by the City Council in 1957. So these are intentional acts, not just by the federal government, by the local government. They weaken the zoning laws to make it easier for noxious industries to be in the residential areas of East Austin. So the practice was there then between the banks and the realtors, making sure that they kept folks of color east of I-35. Still a practice that was going on well into the 21st century. Gentleman that moved down here was saying a few years ago, or saying recently that a few years ago, he was trying to find a place. He had to be adamant about looking in Southwest Austin because the realtor kept taking him back to East Austin. So it's an intentional plan. And we need local officials such as Mayor Pro Tem to be able to push back on those things along with the community to say no longer, no more, and to put in policies and practices that are focused on racial equities. And as Richard Rothstein said, these practices are constitutional, so there's an obligation to remedy them and to remove them.
Fantastic. And so I'm going to think a couple of questions together. Hopefully we'll do this well. I kind of want to piggyback off the amazing response from Ashton and also talking about de jure segregation, right? And so while deed restrictions are no longer enforceable, we still have quite a bit of exclusionary zoning that happens across the city, right? And so what are ways that are kind of fiercely defended, kind of how it was discussed by Mayor Pro Tem Garza. And so how are we trying to work towards an inclusive city, and within that work, are we having conversations within the city and the community around race and class, and so when you're thinking about at the end of this film, it boldly says, take responsibility for the actions that have, all the injustices that have occurred. Are we actually working our way towards accepting responsibility and working towards unraveling those injustices? And that's we'll give it to Neferetitti and we'll kind of work our way around.
Maybe I shouldn't have been smiling because I had a number of different thoughts when you were saying that. You know, I think for me to say that we are not doing anything would be unfair. We have seen some bold leadership taking place throughout the city of Austin. And I do want to clarify, I am not the displacement prevention officer. That is, I thank you for giving me that wonderful title. I am the housing and policy planning manager. That's something that's coming up the line for someone, who knows. But my title is housing and policy planning manager. I think number one, the community continues to push for something bolder than what we have seen in the past in this city. And I do know that's why we do have the new displacement prevention division. It was also because of the community's push that we had the $250 million housing bond. And then we heard from the council meeting on the 17th, community members are pushing for something different. And I think city leadership is responding, you know, so, and even around the land development code, I know that was very contentious and we're still in a stalemate, but I think I see, and especially behind the scene, there's a lot of work going on that the public does not see around policy and planning and housing staff and working with the equity office. We are trying to get this right. We're facing many displacement pressures that are no different than any other city. And what we know is in order to get it right, we do have to take very bold action. And I think Brian Oakes, he said something I think is very bold, and we just don't want to prevent displacement. We have to do some strong corrective actions. And it's almost like reversing what we see now, because the displacement of Black and Brown people in Austin has been devastating to our communities. And you see it, as Ashton talked about, what it looks like in East Austin and how Black people are, I mean, we're so scattered and dispersed, and they've chosen to leave Austin. So I will say that there has been some great steps taken. There is so much more that needs to happen. We haven't gotten displacement correct yet, but I think if we continue to move in the direction that we're going, I think we have a very unique opportunity to make some very positive changes in Austin, and even thinking about Project Connect and the allocation, perhaps if it's passed, of $300 million to address displacement prevention. So we can, and we're moving, but I want to say to the community, you have to keep the pressure on, because I mean, you are the voice that city leadership and housing staff and other staff that we respond to. And so keep the pressure up.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of bring in Awais into this conversation, kind of on that last part is, so keeping the pressure on, but is the community really engaging in active conversation around race and class, and like, what does it look like for us working to work towards racial justice here in Austin?
I think, again, thank you all for bringing this important conversation together. I do want to say, I feel like we're in a better place than where we have been. And I think this summer alone has, really proved to all of us how much the community can and, is able to and can move where we are as a city and how we think about racial justice and so many other things. And I agree with what Neferetitti said. We have, great leadership now, which is, I'll be honest, a big change. From where I stand and from the perspective that I have, having true representation of leadership of color in our city council, in other spaces of leadership in our city, as we're seeing on this panel alone, I think is very meaningful to see that sort of representation, to have folks speak from their own experience, speak from the perspectives of the communities that they're representing. And I think that's really critical and important. But on the question of can we engage more? Yes, we do need to engage more. And I think, one of the things that I looked at was the work that was done in Minneapolis on their land development code. They were going through their comprehensive plan, and they had some pieces of the land development conversation as a big part of it. And one of the things that they did very conscientiously was they had a university project and a professor really talking about racial deed restrictions and the history of other deed restrictions and how they had played out in the city. comparing to sort of these, exactly what Ashton was saying, these historical patterns of segregation that continue and live to today. It's not that they have been eradicated and have gone away, those persist. And I think just really talking very conscientiously about those patterns and how they exist today. And I think exactly what Neferetitti was saying, that it will require actual thought out action to overcome that. We cannot simply say that, now that we have equality, everything will be fine, but it will require really concerted, equitable actions to correct that. And I think that's where our conversation as a community should really go.
Kendra?
Yeah, please.
Could I say something?
Absolutely. And anybody can jump in.
Building on what Awais is saying, and this really goes back to what Richard Rothstein was saying. So back in the 50s and 60s, and even the 70s, when white folks would see the conditions of slums, they would blame the residents. Well, you had the same thing happen here in Austin. And that's why it's so important to tell the truth and to tell a context and tell a history. That's why the 1928 plan is so important. When we were doing an initiative facing East Austin a few years ago, one of the things folks said when we were talking about the 1928 plan was, everyone knows about that. You don't need to talk about that. And that's not true. I would say clearly 90% of Austinites clearly unaware of that, even for sophisticated folks. I have a partner who's in real estate, an acclaimed real estate lawyer, didn't know about the 1928 plan until 5 years ago. So it's important to have the context, because otherwise we wind up blaming the victims, those who live in those areas, and deal with the consequences. When we talk about the vestiges of the consequences of those actions from 28 to 57 to 67, today the life expectancy between East and West is significant. 21 years between two different zip codes, one on the West side, one on the East side. 21 years. That's a lifetime. The wealth gap between East and West, ginormous. And it comes from that. So it's not about people not working hard enough. It's not about people who don't care about their children. It's not about that at all. These are intentional acts that were put in place years ago that continue to pour out poor outcomes today. And as was said earlier about it, you have to be intentional about stopping them. Good wishes aren't going to do it. You have to be intentional about having a racial equity lens and putting in policies and enacting those policies and implementing them with strategies that will arrest and correct the wrongdoings from the past. And it's important to build teams around those, and that team must include those with lived-in experiences. They bring a special, unique expertise to the table in order to stop it. So some of those conversations are taking place. They have been for the last few years. I'm grateful for the work, the teams that are doing Undoing Racism, the teams that are doing Beyond Diversity training. The City Council has gone through Beyond Diversity, and you can see the outcomes and from their policies and strategies over the last couple of years, from them getting and gaining a racial equity lens. And it's also important, as Awais said, to have folks with lived experience sitting up there on the dais, as opposed to having a majority of folks from just one or two different zip codes in the city who have no lived experience, may have good intentions, but really have no experience and no relationships with folks of color.
I wanted to chime in quickly about deed restrictions and why panels like this, and as everybody has mentioned, understanding the history and continuing to educate people on the history, because deed restrictions there was only one reason for them, and they have racist origins, and that's the only reason. I remember when I purchased my home in South Austin, in the deed, and I went to go look for it, and I couldn't find it in time to be able to read it exactly, but it was basically only a person of color could live on my property if they lived in the servants' quarters. And I remember running, I don't know if it was the 3M or the Austin half or one of the races, but it was through the Shoal Creek area. And it was right kind of in the middle of the land development code thing. And I'll never forget, I took a picture of it actually, and I need to find it. There was a house that said, enforce deed restrictions. Right next to that sign, that same house, it said Black Lives Matter.
What's my
And I feel like people don't know, they have to realize how those two don't go together. You can't believe in enforcing deed restrictions and think it just doesn't go together. And so it's so important to understand the context and history and why they were in place, and why it's important that we have these kinds of conversations and educate people, because I firmly believe the person that lived in that house felt like they were the most progressive person, but you can't, it doesn't align with, the history and the origins of deed restrictions.
Yeah, and I was talking to a professor about how deed restrictions are also not very transparent, and so it's really hard to find them unless you're actually buying a home. And so also making sure that they come to light, and are they still playing into HOAs or other ways that are kind of exclusionary zoning that prohibit people of color from entering neighborhoods outside of income levels, which tends to still be a perpetuated exclusionary zoning tactic in order to keep homogenous communities intact, right? And so I kind of wanted to kind of still play in that homeowner space and say, right, so kind of to Richard Rothstein's in the video, in the film, home ownership has historically been the pathway for wealth, right? With homeowners benefiting from rising housing prices. And so what role do you think homeownership should play in the future of housing and in intergenerational wealth building? And that's kind of an open question for folks.
Sometimes this is very hard for me, who working for the city and just finding that fine line of not advocating for it. But I will share this. There is a concern of mine that I do have, that we understand that more than 50% of households in Austin are renters. And that's one of the characteristics of people who are vulnerable to displacement. So if that's true, if we have a problem, then you have this larger number of people who are renters. Then one of the answers, not the only, but one of the answers is, how do we expand home ownership opportunities, right? How do we provide more programming? And one of the displacement prevention tools should be increasing home ownership. It's that easy to me. It's not very hard. It's not very complicated, but we still, because it is a wealth building tool. And although, and I will say, this is Neferetitti speaking, this is not me as my role as a city staff person. I do believe that if you're not going to give people the economic wherewithal to become homeowners, then land trusts work, right? I think we should do more with land trusts, but that is one, and this is very conflicting, and I'll tell you why later. It's one of the few ways that Black and Brown people have to build wealth in their families. And so that is a key area that I think we should be investing and turning our resources. And I get it right now, as a result of COVID, we are investing a lot in rental assistance. I get it, and it's needed. But we need to think about more long-term strategies and how do we better prepare families so that they can become homeowners so they're less vulnerable to displacement. But then on the other side, this is the conflict, right? The conflict is we really need to address the problem of housing that is commodified, right? So I even have this conflict because we really can't essentially pour enough money into this problem. But I think that's one solution. And I think long-term solution is look at more cooperative models. But I think a long-term solution is to begin to help more renters become homeowners and providing a larger stock of home ownership options.
So I'll add that in addition to what Neferetitti says, I think we should go back and re-examine the whole premise about the house being the major source of wealth accumulation. I'm not sure that's the right premise. I think sometimes we're given a formula that was started umpteen years ago, and we're not sure exactly why it was started. And then we, instead of stopping and examining and saying, does that formula make sense for us today? We take it and say, how can we make it better? And I think sometimes we need to say, does it even make sense? And you know, the tax deduction for home ownership wasn't started with the housing boom. It was put in place in 1913 for then, you know, the ultra rich, and who didn't need to have an incentive for home ownership. That wasn't necessary. And today the United States is, you know, sort of middling as far as home ownership among industrialized countries. So our tax incentive is not really driving home ownership in this country. And with the new laws, tax amendment that went into place recently, it's really having an impact on that and not providing much of a benefit for homeowners, unless you're really at a certain tax bracket and can make deductions. And then there are those that are saying that our system actually is decreasing demand or increasing demand and is therefore raising the price. So it's having the opposite effect that we wanted to have. So given all of that, and given the number of renters, and given the fact that 50% nationwide of Blacks and Hispanics are homeowners, or under 50%, compared to 73% of whites, then maybe we should look at other tools for wealth accumulation in addition to homes. And maybe we should also look at giving breaks to those who are renters in some other format, instead of penalizing them and saying, well, the only way you can get free from this is this myth of home ownership. So I think we need to re-examine the whole premise of that and stop pushing everyone to home ownership and say, let's push them and increase the number of tools available for wealth accumulation. That's the goal.
Can I just add, I agree, but my fear is we start changing the rules with Black and brown people, and we don't give them, and we never, and I agree with you, Ashton, but why is it with our communities, our people, oh, well, we'll do land trust. They're not building. I mean, it's with us that the rules are changed, and let's try this different way when they've already accumulated wealth. And I'm not saying, and I, as I shared, I do have a problem with it, but it's almost like by the time we start figuring this stuff out, then the rules are changed again. And I agree with you. We do need to examine some other rules, or other ways or methods. And I know I'm going to be quiet, but that was just a thought. It's like, why do we change the rules now with us? Now you guys don't get this opportunity.
Well, I'm saying change it to a benefit. We're not benefiting from it now, right? And the way the tax law was changed, unless you're ultra rich, you're still not going to benefit from it. White, Black, or different, but more Blacks are being penalized, if you will, by it. So I'm saying, if we want to be true and say, oh, the goal is wealth accumulation, let's not buy the premise that the only way to get there is through home ownership. And let's increase ways for home ownership. I'm with you. This isn't a zero-sum game, one or the other. It's look at other tracks. And let's not just tell people the only way to get there is through home ownership. Let's look at some of the other rules. Let's stop penalizing people for renting. So those are some of the things I'm saying that we should look at. So I'm all for home ownership, but I'm saying let's not penalize those that are renters at the same time and give them an avenue for wealth accumulation, including looking at the tax code.
I was sad. I don't think I could say it as well as already been said by, both Nefertiti and Ashton. But I think, we do see that tension all the time. And I think I tend to agree with Ashton saying, we have to really evaluate, have people of color in this country really benefited from home ownership? And sadly, the recession has showed us that the people who have faced the brunt of, losing value have actually been Black and brown homeowners. So first, we know that even if you have the same credit scores, you have the same everything, you were more likely to receive subprime mortgages if you were a person of color. Right. You were more likely to be steered to a neighborhood where values wouldn't rise at the same level. We're now still talking about how, even the way values are evaluated, in appraisals, the appraisals for homeowners of color are lower than those for white homeowners. And then post-recession, we're seeing the banks, as we're cracked down on subprime mortgages, and we said these are predatory, the way banks have decided to fix that is to deny more and more mortgages to homeowners of color. So really, I think I agree that, homeownership is important, will remain important, and is something that we need to address and really assess the racial roots of in some ways as well, but also at the same time see that we do not penalize those who are not homeowners or who do not have access to it at the moment. And one strong way to actually provide a pathway to homeownership is really give people the ability to be really stable as renters and tenants, which in this country is really hard. So if you have that stability and affordability as renters, that in itself is a pathway to homeownership as you build credit, as you build equity, as you build sort of the stability needed for that. But I really appreciate this conversation.
So I want to touch on a question and a comment that was made in the chat, and also kind of filter in with another comment, right? So that's the sort of tension that we as AJC also have when we're having community conversations about why I got to be Black people who have to adjust to the new norm of, or try this new thing out, right? And so how do you balance out, where do you invest your resources to be able to balance between, helping folks who want to strive for homeownership, who's been waiting generations to be able to do that, to own their first home, with newer models of community and trust and different community-based models around housing, right? And so, and also how can or should, which I'm gonna be like Nefertiti, I'm super yes to my question I'm about to ask, but how does reparations for Black folks for these injustices get wrapped up into this work and into policy changes? To anybody who wants to answer that question?
There's a term in law, I'm a lawyer, called restitution. And when a victim loses property, either through someone else's negligence or recklessness or intentional act, that perpetrator is asked to make restitution to make the person whole. It may sound uncomfortable to talk about restitution when you talk about slavery and all the consequences from it. When you talk about the 1928 plan, reaffirmed in 1957, and the consequences of that upon Hispanics and Blacks, et cetera. But there's a financial penalty. There's a health penalty that folks have paid because of that. When you think about the families that live next to a tank farm in East Austin, a tank farm, that is gas companies, one of which was my client, that had a depository for their oil and gas in the ground, that even though it was remediated, 20 years ago, today, environmental standards say it's still not safe for families to live there today. We can only put commercial property there. So if it's not safe today, 20 years after remediation, what was it like 30, 40 years ago when the families were actually living there and the tank farm was operating? What about those health consequences? So I think there is a cost to pay. There is restitution that should be made for a variety of reasons to Black folks, to Latinx folks. And so I think it's a difficult conversation. It makes folks uncomfortable, but we have no problem in putting it in other contexts. If one corporation sues another corporation because they breached the contract, we say there's restitution to be made. what's the difference here? The contract that was breached for people of color is called the United States Constitution. And there should be restitution for the damages from that. We may have a difficult time figuring out what those damages are, but the damages are there nonetheless. And that could be part of the incentive or what's given as it relates to whether it's home ownership or other forms of wealth accumulation.
I would, we have all these conversations around, I totally agree with everything that Ashton said, all these conversations around equity, but we really don't want to address equity. We think that equity is about getting it right here and moving forward. You cannot have equity if you don't deal with the past injustices. That is not equity. That is fair. That's not equity. And so, and if you, and again, someone, and the comments that are coming in through the chat are great comments. That's Richard Rothstein's whole premise, right? He's really laying out the case, because you can see how wealth was stolen from Black communities throughout the decades. And so there's this huge wealth gap. It's not because of the false narrative that has been put forth about Black people being lazy, not caring for their neighborhoods, not working hard. It's none of that. And I'm also working separately on a paper, and I'm researching all of these articles, and you can see it. The Atlantic has done a great job of telling the story of how land was stolen from so many Black farmers. I mean, and if I tell you this even goes through the 2000s, it's not just way back then. This is still happening, and it's so incredible that our justice system is not properly addressing these problems. And so equity, to me, has to be, it is about it's about restitution, right? And it's not just about a policy. I don't want a policy. I don't. I'm just gonna, I will say, give me my 40 acres and a mule. Then let me decide how I want to handle my wealth, my opportunities. And so, and some people are saying, I don't want anything. I'm okay with that too. Step out of the line and let other people get in line and divvy up for those people, because we have lost so much. And this is why the wealth gap is so huge. And the only way that you can address that is through corrective actions.
Amen.
Couldn't say it better myself. So I'm gonna keep that feeling in the air, but I'm also gonna switch it over to Azhar, who's gonna continue the conversation around displacement and how, when we're still thinking about tools and balancing out and making sure that we are righting wrongs and also addressing climate change and moving forward, and what does that look like for the community of Austin? How are we working towards that? So I'm going to pass it over to Azhar.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I'm so thrilled to be in this conversation. This has been an amazing talk so far. We have a lot of great questions from the participants, and I want to make sure to get to some of those too. So I will ask that if you're willing to stay a little bit later than our 7:30 timeline, just because there are so many good ones. But as Kendra said, and we want to talk about some of the policies that we have put in place. And throughout this conversation, we've talked about there needs to be more than just the appeal of going for equity. There needs to be a thought out process for it. So I want to talk about some of the things that have been put in place already, some of the anti-displacement strategies that have been discussed and are currently being implemented into the city. So for Mayor Pro Tem Garza, I just want to know, could you lay out a couple of the strategies that the city has implemented and where you'd hope for those to go further? And then how there's kind of a block from the state. There's really so far that the city can go. The state really does limit so much of what we're able to do. So what state statutes should we be trying to eliminate or change to actually get the results that we need in the city?
Sure. So some of the strategies We have a new right to return policy that we just implemented for the first time. We invested for the first time in $250 million affordable housing bond. The city also provides financial assistance for homeowners, as well as rental assistance. Even before the current RISE program and rent program, the city did provide financial assistance. I did want to briefly touch on there's always so many ideas. The problem is the limited money that we have to address the ideas. And so absolutely, if we had unlimited dollars, doing more of subsidizing home ownership. I think one of my biggest, my first controversial issues the first time I was in the news is because I pushed for home ownership in a PUD in my district. And the way that home ownership was subsidized was the city waiving some of the utility fees, service fees to that developer. And that became a huge issue. And so when you have a limited amount of dollars, and you can either subsidize one family for home ownership, but that same amount of money would subsidize maybe, and I don't know, these numbers aren't right, 8 families for rental, and you're trying to decide, well, am I subsidizing home ownership or do I subsidize rental because I'm affecting more families that way? That's always a constant rub as a council member you're making decisions on, and you're given options that are both, neither one of them are, the one that you want to decide on, but you have to choose a side. And so, but back to some of the strategies is, investing in affordable housing. I think this council has done that more. We don't even have conversations about, technically we're not allowed to ask for it. It's just supposed to be a conversation that comes up. And so, I feel like from my first year on council to now, it's not even a conversation I have to bring up. We're thinking of this development, and there's 10% affordable housing at 60% or 60% MFI. And so I think this council's done a good job of having our development community know the things that are important to us. What the things as far as state things that could help us, every time I go out into the community, the 2 questions I get asked is, why can't the city basically rent control? Why can't the city say that my landowner, why don't you institute a rule that doesn't allow my landlord to increase the rent? And he can't. That's rent control, and it's against the law. Requiring a certain amount unless it's like, especially in by right type of zoning, unless they're asking for a density bonus of some sort or asking for more than what they would normally get in the zoning that they have or they're asking for, we can't require affordable housing. There have been attempts, and it's on our legislative agenda again to have that kind of, to allow us to do that kind of thing, but we're unfortunately prohibited from requiring affordable housing and from basically freezing people's rent. But in the bond election that will, Project Connect, it will include $300 million in anti-displacement dollars. That, as far as I know, is one of the biggest investments any city has made in connection with a transit bond. And so those are some of the things that the city has done, and as well as addressing the question of what more we could do, but unfortunately are prohibited from doing because of state law.
Thank you. And kind of going back to a point that Ashton had touched on earlier and that we had been discussing, was just on how our political system really tends to prioritize home ownership. Having a home is such a big part of the American dream. Part of the strategy is to get people to have homes so that we can invest and have more equity and more wealth through intergenerational means. But the question would be then, is that correct? Should we be focusing so much, or can we focus more efforts onto renters? How can we lift up renters' voices in the current process? And so the question I'll ask for Ashton is, can we engage and give renters more of a voice in our city politics?
You're on mute, sorry.
Sorry about that. So yeah, can and we should. I mean, the fact that the question is asked underscores the sort of less than view that we have toward renters. It's almost like when you grow up and become a homeowner, but right now you're just a renter. You have less of a voice, you're less of a person, you're not successful. And I think that's a false assumption. There may be many reasons why someone wants to become a renter. Or what about the person who just graduated from high school or graduated from college, gets a job, they're a renter? They're still a contributing member of society. There should be no less than. We should not be pitting one against the other. And so we need to find tools. We need to elevate. We need our leaders, elected and otherwise, to lift up the position of renters and give them equal voice. So we're not pitting one against the other. Inside our neighborhoods, we need to do better as far as building bridges between renters and home owners, so that they're speaking together, have the same mission, have the same goal. Even if the renter knows that they're going to be gone soon, while they're there, they're still teammates with that homeowner. So I think much more that we can do, both from the policy side and as far as the way we interact with them and the way we treat them.
Sorry, Neferetitti.
I was just going to add, I will say a major voice on the anti-displacement task force was Basta, Shoshana with Basta. And I think she did a great job of elevating the need to address renters and displacement priorities that address renters as well. She's also engaged in I guess it's a community group focused on anti-displacement, and there are a number of renters as well as people focused on affordable housing. So you do see us working together collectively, collaboratively, to address the needs of households as opposed to renters and tenants. And I'm seeing it behind the scenes myself. So I think we're doing a better job of addressing it and here.
Thank you for giving a shout out to Basta. They do a great job, Shasta does. So thank you very much for covering my lapse there.
Oh, no, you did a great job.
I just wanted to briefly talk about a policy at the city level that gives homeowners more power, essentially. And I saw a question or a comment in the chat about how do you get people involved when the system is basically run by people that have benefited from the current system. And it made me think of like ballot petition rights. And so if you are, if there's a zoning request close to you, they have to send out notification of that zoning change within a certain perimeter of that property. And and people can say, I don't want that zoning to happen. Like, I don't want that. And so that requires a supermajority of council. If a certain percentage of and you have to be a homeowner. If a certain percentage of homeowners, I think it's over 20, but I could be wrong about that. It requires a higher level of a supermajority of council. So you have to get 9 votes for that zoning case to pass. And that is, it's saying that homeowners have more rights and more ability to stop. And it's kind of to that question, how do you get more housing supply, and whether that be rental, when the people in the ownership position are the ones that get to decide how hard it is for that or not, for that to be built or not. And so, that's actually one of the big issues holding up our land development code, was whether the entire city should be able to vote on whether to be able to implement or to allow basically petition rights to homeowners for the land development code. But I also want to say, I hope renters, and I'm certain that they do know that they absolutely have power. And I would say an election very close to me, I believe, was won because young people voted. And when the majority of our city are renters, my assumption, and we don't know that, right? Those are like numbers we don't see when you see the precinct, turnout. But my assumption would be renters made the decision on some very key races in this primary. And so the power is there. There just needs to be some, and the uprising that created that was criminal justice reform in this particular instance, but there's gotta be, I've just been waiting for that uprising to happen around housing and housing policy, because they absolutely have the power. It's just a matter of showing up and having your voices heard.
I was quickly going to add something to feel like a lot has been covered, but I think one other thing I want to point out is for a very long time, we have depended on, the small area planning, neighborhood associations and contact teams to drive a lot of our land use decisions, including where rental housing is built. And until a few years ago, we had organizations that, explicitly did not allow renters to be a part of them. And so we have homeowners who've been involved in this process and have, in some cases, until very recently, explicitly excluded renters from the process of decision-making around these issues. And I think, that has improved, as has been mentioned, there have been major improvements in how we do a lot of different things, but still a lot of the, the petition rights, the way neighborhood associations are constructed and integrate with our decisions that we made around housing and affordable housing and rental housing, it still has a tendency to privilege homeowners. And I think that's really important. And I think I agree with what has been said, renters have a lot of ability and power to do a lot of different things. I'm a lifelong renter. I've never owned, my parents have never owned while I've lived with them. So I live in rental housing all my life. And I cannot say that I have not been engaged in my community or that I did not see my parents being engaged in their community. I think we really need to get over those notions as well and talk about how much value renters bring to communities as well. And I think we can get on this panel.
Yeah,
absolutely. And talking about zoning, and not just, so we talked about kind of how homeownership has kind of blocked some of the developments in land use and some of the changes in zoning. And I think that kind of gets to a more specific type of homeownership, which is single family unit homes. So as discussed in the video, at this stage in Austin and a lot of larger cities, owning single family home is prohibitively expensive for a lot of first time buyers, low income, and people of color. So why is it so hard? It has been so hard. And I think with these conversations, we've talked about why it's so hard to build other types of homes. Is it a good idea to push for the elimination of single family zoning as a whole? Is it better to strategize about ways to just change the messaging around it to be more focused on allowing other types near single family? What is the block that's keeping us from changing this process and allowing for more diverse home types of homes, which can be more affordable? And that's an open.
Sorry. Yeah, and I wanted to kind of also add on to that. Sorry, I was also like, how do you also like, thinking about like the actual diversity, inclusion, and equity, like how do you also bring that kind of lens, and not just like lens, but like tangible resources, and creating kind of a integrated or spaces that are really thriving for people of color throughout the cityscape, so that it's not segregated to one side of the city as well.
I'll start. I think it's a combination of things. It always is, right? I think there's a big cultural thing. When you're growing up, the white picket fence house, right? That is a symbol of success. Not even success. That's just what happens in life. You get the house, at some point, I guess. And then it just depends on what, part of the country you grow up in. I went to law school in the Pacific Northwest, and I had some people that lived in that area come visit me. And I remember they were like, oh, you have neighborhoods here, because they thought all Texas was like ranches, like seriously thought that everybody in Texas lived on a ranch or like a large piece of land. And I think so many people, the idea of, brownstones and like the townhomes is not something to them feels like a house. I've had this discussion with my husband when we want to move closer into town. It's
sorry, there's a mouse in my
ear. Okay? It's like, oh my,
I apologize. Keep going. Sorry.
If we want to move closer into town, it would likely be a condo, and his idea of that being a home is not, and so I think there's a combination of changing what we think of a home. But I also think that in a lot of ways, it's about lot sizes, not, there's single family homes and there's lot sizes. If we reduce we have these minimum lot sizes, and when most of your value's in the land, that is prohibitive for people to be able to buy the land and as well as the house. But I obviously only have about less than 4 months on the council. I would now and would have always supported eliminating single family housing, because I think in a lot of ways we have on many of our traditional single family zoning, they allow an accessory dwelling unit or a duplex. And so in many ways, I feel like we have eliminated it. But when Ashton in the beginning talked about the infrastructure around us, and I also want to make that point that when we have these policies that really combined with the culture of people thinking a house on a piece of land is what I'm supposed to get, and a brand new home, and we create sprawl. All these policies have created sprawl, and then Southeast Austin is seeing so much growth, but we don't have grocery stores, we don't have hospitals, we don't have, and so the bulk of the work that I have been doing is, we don't have fire stations. It was a fight to get a fire station, and that is incredibly expensive. And so people, they don't want their taxes going up, but then when we move out, past 183, and then we're like, well, I don't have fire stations, I don't have a rec center. It's like that all is, it costs money, there's cost to all of that. So I guess I kind of went everywhere there, but I definitely would have supported, and would still support it. I think it's the right thing to do. I think it allows for all types of housing for all kinds of people in all parts of town. And that's what I have always supported, and a policy that I will always support. And anything that we can do to keep families closer to grocery stores, closer to clinics, closer to rapid transit, that's how we really build equity and accessibility, and pushing people out. Single family housing really just pushes people out to areas that don't have services that they really need.
I don't know if anyone want to say any last minute comments, but if not, we'll go ahead and move on to the Pat of this.
I'll just quickly, add to that. I think that pretty much covers a lot of conversation, but I think the question really is about flexibility in housing choice, right? It's it's not about like eliminating a certain kind of housing typology, or it's not related to that, but it's really about allowing people greater choice, which currently our city does not have the kind of housing choice that we need and we see. And another aspect of that is, where does that go and what does that look like? And I think, Mayor Pro Tem Garza, raises a good point. And I'm going to call out neighborhoods with no conversation about the intentions of the folks who live there, right? But if we honestly just go, across Mopac on Lake Austin Boulevard, or go north, and we look at the neighborhoods there, and we see how many of those places have done, duplexes or ADUs and have done denser housing, and you drive east and you look at the housing there and you will see denser housing. And I think we really have to also ask ourselves, in terms of this question of, density and everything else, talking about geography with that is so important. And when we talk about housing choice, where that housing choice is being built is important. And we do not have the kind of allowability to have housing choice west of Mopac or in West Austin in general, or in neighborhoods that have been historically exclusionary. And I think that's an important thing for us to tackle as well. Have more diverse kinds of housing products that serve a lot of different people, but also ensure that they're in diverse parts of town, particularly in places that have excluded those kind of housing products in the past.
Absolutely.
Hey, I'm going to tie a few of the questions I've seen in the comments together. Several of them had to do with deed restrictions, so I'll just kind of string a few of these together. One, is it possible to eliminate deed restrictions if you find them? Two, what can be done at the state level to change deed restrictions? And if a deed restriction exists, is there a way to get rid of it? So again, that question. So I guess just for deed restrictions, and for everyone that knows a little bit about them, they're very difficult to remove. They are incredibly hard to get changed. And I believe the city council only has limited ability to change them. It really takes state effort to do it. But for the panel, what would you say is the most important thing to try to change or try to move forward to create more equitable decisions for deeds when it comes to deed restrictions?
So I'll sort of try to take a stab at it. And before I start, I just really want to say y'all have some amazing people listening in. This could have been a round table and not a panel. And we could have had a conversation with these folks. So I feel like we've been listening to things come in. But I think so one of the things that can be done is actually homeowners and associations and homeowners associations themselves tackling deed restrictions is one major way in which they can be undone, which is hard because you have to get a majority of the homeowners within that area to become a part of it. And I think that goes to show in some ways the resistance to getting rid of them. So I think the first question is, do we really want to get rid of them? Are we ready as a community? Are you as a neighborhood ready to get rid of your deed restrictions, or are you only saying that you're willing to get rid of them? And if you are, then are you willing to take the steps to actually undo them? And an example of that has been if you're not enforcing a deed restriction over a certain amount of time, and in a lot of ways that deed restriction has been violated, then you can go to the court and have it overturned, essentially saying that people have enjoyed their right to property without the existence of that deed restriction, as has been seen in the past. So essentially, a lot of it has to go to homeowners coming together and doing it themselves. But at the city level, we're definitely very limited in what we can and cannot do at a local governance level to get rid of them. And this was a conversation that came up again and again when we were going through a land development code, and folks were like, well, what about deed restrictions? Are we accounting for them when we're talking about rezoning parts of the city? And the fact of the matter is, the biggest thing is we don't even have current data on where deed restrictions holistically are, what they look like, which ones are where and how they all come together. And I know there has been some research at the University of Texas in the past. There's some happening now. Folks are trying to figure that out, but I think that will be crucial to begin with for us to have a clear idea of our current deed restrictions as we go about trying to undo them.
Thank you. Another question from the comments was, is there an aesthetic or design component of displacement and gentrification? And should architects be more aware of impacts on design? Or is that inflating the role of the designer? Is it really more down to the economics and the policy in the area, like what stores are around in the neighborhood? And again, open to the panel.
I will definitely say that nothing happens in a vacuum. I mean, sometimes we don't often know in terms of the beginning of where things have their origin, like how certain homes became to be valued over others. There's definitely a design aspect that has to do with displacement. Taking it a little further beyond the architects in terms of what we talk about in terms of revitalizing, in terms of talking about neighborhoods, making them diverse, using words to describe. I'll just give a clear example, like Six Square, or the African American Cultural Heritage District that had been predominantly African American. When there was this desire to make it more appealing to people who would be considered gentrifiers, young, white, people looking to dwell in the urban center and be closer to the urban center, we began to use words to describe a new aesthetic. We wanted to erase the presence of Black people, but use terms to describe these historic spaces. So we sort of made it hip and cool to be in this gritty, what used to be a gritty Black neighborhood, but now we want to promote diversity. So it's a way, and I think in that sense, we use aesthetics to sort of clean and erase the presence of Black and brown people. And I think that's something that we really need to address, and it hasn't been addressed. But you know, I always thought it was very ironic to me coming here and leading a Black cultural arts district, and there are no Black bodies, seeing photographers in the neighborhood taking pictures of the few Black people who remained as if they were some novelty. But so we use aesthetics as a way to sanitize Black and brown spaces. And I think that is the beginning steps of gentrifying a community or spaces where Black and brown people, and then changing the narratives about who lives there or who lived there, right? And we try to we try to sanitize it. So there is a danger in that, using aesthetics in that way. But the architecture too, but that's a longer conversation, and I don't feel as gifted and skilled to discuss that.
So I would mention that, yes, architecture can be either exclusive or inclusive. And I'm not an architect, let's clarify that. But that's clearly the case. And I think that's why it's important that when we talk about institutional racism, it's not just in law enforcement, it's not just in healthcare, it's not just in education, it's in all our institutions, including creative. And that includes architecture. And so that's why it's important for them to develop an equitable lens and understand how their work can either be inclusive or exclusive. And so I'll give hats off to ULI, Austin chapter, and to the architects in Austin. Over the last 12 months, they've been working to become more racially, or develop a more racially equitable lens and trying to learn, et cetera. And I'd also say that when it comes time to designing communities, that's why I'm a proponent of place-based planning, is that you have the community in the same with the architects and designers and the builders, et cetera, so they can speak to what it is that they desire, what they want, et cetera, and have that conversation. Suppose designers and builders build something they think is aesthetically pleasing or will work, and then telling folks, here it is for you. And so I think that's one thing. So designers, they know what they know, but they don't know what they don't know, architects. And so we need the folks in the community, the residents, to be able to, here's something I hadn't thought of. Here's something that it is that we need for our family situation. I know what you did in Chicago may have worked there, what you did in South Austin, but right here in Colony Park, this is what it is that we're looking for, that we need. I need you to design for that. And so that's what we need to be pushing through, is incorporating those different voices, and everyone brings their particular expertise, knowing that the community has their own expertise that they bring to the table. And that's one of the things that we need to bring going forward, currently and going forward. The last thing I'll say to that is that Colony Park is on the cusp of doing that. The community has been pushing very hard over the last 7 or so years to talk about and to incorporate. And the city has been yielding to and listening to and incorporating that kind of place-based planning. It's not perfect, but they've been a lot more than they had in the past, over the past 7 years or so. And so it's a growth thing, but I think they're building a template that the cities use throughout the city in developing and revitalizing other communities.
Fantastic. Sorry, please.
No, Kendra, go ahead.
Okay. Do you want to kind of do one last question and then we'll kind of wrap it up with final thoughts?
Sure. And again, everyone, there are so many amazing questions y'all have asked. Like, we put together a list of 14 or so, and we thought we're not going to get to all those, but we'll see if we have to include some of them just in case. And yeah, blown away. So I really apologize for not asking everyone's questions. Thank you all so much for participating. And so with no order of how I'm ranking which question next to ask, just the one in front of me. This one was, should we talk about gentrification and displacement in the same conversation as homelessness? Or should these be separate conversations? And I'm going to leave that one open.
Short answer is yes. Obviously, it depends case by case analysis, but depending on the situation where you get displaced, the next stop may be homelessness. We make it seem like, oh, the person just had the choice. They got kicked out of their neighborhood of choice, so they'll go find another neighborhood. Sometimes there's a gap in time between when they get to that next neighborhood and they are homeless. So it needs, I think the simple answer, yes, it needs to be part of that conversation. We need to be aware that that is one of the dangers of displacement.
I was going to say one quick thing I'll add to that is I think I would agree with that answer. And I think just, thinking about the fact that all three of these things, gentrification, displacement, homelessness, are completely racialized and have a disproportionate impact on people of color and communities of color, which should tell us that they have something in common. And one of those things really is, who do we value in our community? Whose needs do we value in our community? And how do we all come together and start saying, that not only communities of color and, homeowners of color and renters of color, but even, unhoused folks of color in our community matter. And we are here to support them and support their needs and ensure that their needs are met. And I think, so for me, that racialized aspect of these aspects, of these three factors really brings it in together in how interlinked they are and how integral they are to how we value and devalue certain kind of communities and people and homes.
Exactly.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree with all of that. And when you think of the film, every issue that it brought up that policymakers enabled and our federal government enabled, all of that created gentrification, displacement, and homelessness. And so in addressing them more specifically, we often talk about them differently because there are different ways to address the different levels of someone's homelessness, even amongst just that in that one area. But they are definitely very related, and the effects of failed policies.
It's the residential continuum,
So I kind of want to end with final thoughts and also kind of still in the racialized lens of how our housing policy has created the inequities and inequalities that we exist. And so when you're going back to how do we continue having these conversations around race and class in a way that wealthy white neighborhoods want to give up their deed restrictions, that we're creating culturally competent and diverse architects and urban planners that create these spaces that exist for cultural vibrancy and that feel that you have as a person of color, that this neighborhood space is comfortable for you, right? And how do we move forward so that we can have a city that looks like that and that actually is quote unquote part of our imagination, our imagined plan, but how do we work towards that and still address historical injustices? Kind of the big question at the end, but kind of tying it all back together of like, where do we go from here?
I'll start. I'll just share that a couple of things. We have to remember that the struggles of oppression are all struggles about space. Who gets to be present, whether it's public space, private space, and how do people get to exist in those spaces. So if we're able to remember that as we begin to do our planning and policies or whatever, wherever you are in addressing these issues, contesting who gets to exist in these spaces, I think as a whole, as what we're dealing with also is challenges to what we have believed about our society, about America, about this great nation. And it's been this story, and I'm using this, Toni Morrison referred to it as a master narrative. And it's this narrative about the standard of everything that exists. It's this white narrative, and we really need to challenge at every level what we've been told about this narrative. And this impacts all of us. I don't care what color you are. It impacts how your family structure looks like, what it looks like. We've been told that the perfect family is a mother, a father, and 2 little kids, right? That's a master narrative that needs to be challenged. We've been told that the success story is you go to college, get married, get a house, live in the suburbs. All of these narratives, they have a root in perpetuating, and this is what we have to understand, in perpetuating white supremacy. And so as a result, we have to examine, when we talk about institutionalized racism, and Ashton said it again, it is the root and the foundation of this country. And so we have to figure out, and I don't think it can be eradicated, because to eradicate it would mean to destroy what is. And that's something that's hard for me to understand, but it doesn't mean we don't have to address, we have to address and acknowledge it. And that's what we have failed to do for so many years. We want to act like we're better. We want to act like we're progressive. We haven't. Until we deal and address and acknowledge the root problems, this country will never be able to address the ills that many of us are addressing and dealing with now. And I'm thankful for scholars like Richard Rothstein and others, and even video cameras, and young people who are bold enough to challenge the system, and people who elected officials like Delia, Garza, who are bold enough to be in spaces like this to address some of these tough questions. And so I'll leave it at that. But we need to begin to challenge the master narrative and create something radically different.
Thank you so much for that, Neferetitti.
I'll just perfect transition to representation matters. And I'll never forget when I was on the speaker group talking about 10-1 before I was a council member, before I was even considering running for council. And I was sent to a neighborhood meeting in Hyde Park. And I was the only person of color in. I got up and I talked about why I thought 10-1 was a good idea and why they should support it. And I'll never forget, a gentleman raised his hand and said, "Why would we support this? We have all the power." And I remember leaving that meeting and telling the 10-1 coalition to not send me back to those, because it took so much to not say anything more than what I did say at that moment. But so I wasn't sent to West Austin anymore. But someone wrote in the comments, and I absolutely agree, that 10-1 has really changed the conversation. And I don't think it's any coincidence that when you look at land use votes, the 4 council members of color vote a certain way. And I think that that's important. And, you know, lastly, I'll say, you know, when I've gone into these tough decisions, I'm always thinking about the voices that aren't there, because almost every single time the voices that aren't there are the ones that need the leaders speaking up for them. And, you know, many people know that I hate crash gates. I think they're awful. And I think about the neighborhood that's going to be on the other side of that crash gate and wish that that was an exit, because it's inconvenient for them to have to just only go out one side. But the neighborhood that was there only compromised and allowed this neighborhood to be built, an extension of a neighborhood. If you put this crash gate here, like, those people aren't allowed to come through our neighborhood to exit, only in the case of an emergency. And I'm always thinking about the voices that aren't there, because at that zoning case, at that moment, the people that are going to be living in that development that's affected by that crash gate, they're not there. And so, you know, that's kind of been my kind of philosophy in many of my decisions. The voices that aren't here, you know, the people that could benefit from this affordable housing complex, the people that could benefit from living closer to grocery stores, they're not here right now. And you know, me and you know, those of us on council who believe that are there to be their voice. And so we've absolutely, renters, young people, we have the power. We just have to get out there and vote. And I'm very grateful for organizations like AJC and AURA, who are really doing the work to try to get more diverse and young voices to the table.
So speaking of tables, I want to thank my fellow panelists for their words today. It's great being with them and listening to their knowledge and their wisdom. And I'm grateful to be co-laborers with them in the city. And I want to thank AURA and AZC for putting on this event and the other great work that y'all do. I would say that Blacks, Latinx, and other people, Latinx and other people of color, are not looking for pity. We're not looking for paternalism. We just want folks, those in power and authority, and the majority of them are white, not by happenstance, to and that they're not doing us a favor. We're not asking for a favor, but they need, for their own sake, not just ours, to listen and believe what's being said. And we're not looking just to be given a seat at the table. That's diversity. That's great. We do need that. And we're not looking to be given the opportunity to sit at a particular seat in the table. That's inclusion. We need that too. That's great. But it's not just that. It's equity. We want there when the table's actually constructed from the very beginning. And as has been said, and I just want to emphasize, those in power and authority, and again, it's mainly whites, have, it may not be that race, institutional racism is a factor for all the disparities we see in health, in wealth, in education attainment, in housing, in the criminal justice system, the civil justice system, but it's the sole factor for which those in power and authority have failed to effectively address or even acknowledge. And that's what needs to happen if we're going to move forward. It's not about revisionist history. It's about accepting the truth and the facts, as uncomfortable as it is. We need to learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and accept the facts and not just move on from that, but acknowledge those. And I'm going to say you're sorry, but that sorry has a dollar sign associated with it, and it comes in many forms. So restitution, as we talked about earlier, and then allow us to be part of the team that builds going forward. Not just speaking on Latinx issues. They're experts on more than just that. And Black speaking on Blackness issues. They're experts on more than just that. Much of which we see and touch and benefit from today, whether it's construction of the Capitol or homes in the various communities from which we're excluded, or the roads, or everything we've seen was built on the backs of the very people who have not been able to enjoy them. Many of the inventions that we've seen by people of color that we enjoy, color monitor, this and that and the other, we need to appreciate the genius that's in the populations of color and partner with them to create a better than what we have now. Partner with them to say, you know what, we're going to try and live up to the Declaration of Independence that says it's for all, that all humans were created equally, that we all have the right to pursue happiness and life and liberty. That has not really happened just yet, and it needs to happen. So I need not just my brown brothers and sisters, my Black brothers and sisters, my Asian brothers and sisters, but I need my white brothers and sisters getting on board and being part of a collective team and saying no more, and we're going to do this right, and building that beloved community that Martin talked about when he was quoting scripture. The last thing I say that they're talking about scripture, there's a component in the Old Testament where the Hebrew children were complaining because they were in exile in Babylon. And the prophet Jeremiah came to them and said, God says, you all need to stop whining and stop just thinking of yourselves. And I need you to build a prosperous community for your fellow folks, because if they prosper, and that prosperity, shalom, it's a wholeness, it's a completeness, having everything you need intellectually, socially, health-wise, et cetera, to be successful. If they're successful, you shall be successful. And there's an innate selfishness in the DNA of America that has to be rooted out. So it's be shared. It can't just be me for myself, because at the end of the day, there's a price tag to be paid for all of us. You know, on the Titanic, when it was floating and everything was fine, folks were seated differently than the poor folks. But when everything went to heck and it started sinking, they were all in the water together. And that's what we'll find here. There is a price to be paid, and be paid by everybody if we don't pursue wholeness, completeness together and respect everybody as we build shalom in a beloved community.
I'm just gonna say, wow, that is all of y'all. That is so hard to follow up on, but I'll try my best. And I think, you know, a lot has been said. One thing I really want to highlight, because it had come up somewhere in the chat, is, you know, Richard Rothstein and other folks have done a great job. And when we talk about these sort of historical injustices, sometimes it seems very historical. And I think it's very clear here that we're talking about things today. When we're talking about like steering from real estate, you know, folks, whether we're talking about how banks discriminate in how they, you know, allow someone to get debt, whether we're talking about the 2008 recession, we're talking about things today. And I think, you know, these injustices continue to build on past injustices, but also new compounded injustices are continuing. And so it's not really just some historical battle that we have to fight against a history that is over, you know, with the Fair Housing Act and other things that happened during the civil rights era, but we're talking about things that are happening today in 2020. And, you know, I think one thing that I'm thinking of as, you know, we're looking forward and where we're going, I would really ask us all to focus on the impacts of COVID-19 and the pandemic that we're seeing, right? We're already seeing in terms of, you know, loss of life and health. We're seeing communities of color, particularly the Latinx community in Austin, is being impacted in a whole different way. But more than that, coming out of this, you know, this pandemic, the economic repercussions, we really have to see and ask for ourselves, you know, that we do not leave our communities of color behind. We do not disinvest in their communities and then bring around gentrification to invest in their communities later, right? So that investment that we put in goes with the divestment that we did earlier. So let's be very conscious of what are we going to do after 2020 and how we're going to move into the future, because that's something we have to address together. And I think, you know, Ashton, you did a great job of just talking about how we all have to, you come together and talk about this in a way where we can see everything together. I was listening to this conversation recently on allyship, and just saying that, is ally even the right word? Because ally implies, right, like being a white ally or even being a brown ally to Black folks implies that I'm in allyship with an issue that you're facing. So you're facing something and I'm going to be an ally and support you on it. But the issue is not just for one person or another, it's for all of us. Like this, a question of solidarity, not allyship. We're not in we're not in allyship with each other, we're in solidarity with each other. Because if we look around us, it's not that just one person's world is on fire, right? We're seeing a whole different set of world in 2020, and we have to see that we are all connected in this, whether it's criminal justice reform, whether it's public health and pandemic issues, whether it's economic recessions, we're all connected, and that solidarity is important. And there was something somebody had mentioned, like, what do we do when these land use conversations come up? Should we speak up if we're from a certain neighborhood where people are opposing? Yes, speak up. Go and speak up. Join the other folks who are fighting something, right? And particularly if you're a white person of color who lives in that neighborhood, and if you're there to fight for the equity of the folks who aren't there, as Mayor Pro Tem Garza was saying, right, the folks who aren't there today, if you can fight for them, that's solidarity. And so I think really, 2020, we have to focus on what's coming next. And we don't know, there's so much uncertainty, but we need to have solidarity with each other and allow, honestly, Black voices to lead this conversation and allow people of color to lead this conversation, but still be in solidarity with each other and follow each other's leadership. So I just want to say thank you to all the amazing folks and all the amazing stuff that you all said. And thank you for putting this together.
This is a bomb panel. I'm super excited that y'all said yes. This is so great. And I'm just going to kind of talk also about, I was asked by a friend, what does it mean? What does abundance mean, right? And kind of going to either Neferetitti or Ashton's comment about this is not a zero-sum game. And it always ends up feeling, or people feel like there's so many scarce resources that it's what is me or you, right? And so that in leaving the fact that we do live in an abundance world, and all tides live, tides live off boats, kind of the thing that of the shalom that Ashton was talking about, right? We live in abundance, and until we get out of that scarcity mindset and know that we live in abundance and that we all can enjoy these prosperity and the fruits of the labor that we work together as a community, I think that's the best way for us to move forward too. So I just want to thank Mayor Pro Tem Garza and Neferetitti Jackmon and Ashton Cumberbach and Awais Azhar, and of course my co-host Cesar Acosta for joining together for this evening's conversation. Has been fantastic, and I just want to thank you both and all the people that had amazing comments and conversation within our chat and in our Q&A. It was dope, and so I'm going to drop some of this out so I can look at it later too. But it was fantastic, and I just want to thank everybody for joining us this evening, and wanted to kind of do a closeout. So thank you so much for your time this evening, and have a great rest of your Monday and your week.
You all as well.
Thank y'all so much.
God bless y'all. Thank you.
Bye.